I think that's a good way to start. If last week was zombies are a signifier of consumerism. This week in Pichy and Pals doing the spooks is vampires. And that means rich predating on the poor and the predator class. But we only really looked at one text today, because both the films we watched were adaptations of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The late 1890s, I should specify 1890s when I say late 90s classic, of a vampire moving into town, trying to suck some blood, and some people stop him. So we watched one of the earliest film adaptations from 1922, Nosferatu, and a film made 70 years later, Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, Nosferatu is another staple of early film studies, and there's these very evocative images towards the end of the film of Nosferatu, Dracula himself, slinking into a house, his shadow creeping on the wall, and his fingers stretching out to clasp and grab what is not his. And they're really, really good images. And if you've ever been to some sort of film lecture, you've probably seen these images. If you've seen H. Bomber Guy's video on how to adapt H.P. Lovecraft's work, he uses these images in a brief tangent about the semiotics of vampirism. And that is basically all you need to see of 1922's Nosferatu. I'm glad that, the film was supposed to be entirely destroyed because the estate of Bram Stoker was not happy that this film was made without his permission and was considered a breach of copyright. And so they managed to get an American court to order the destruction of all copies of the film, but some have slunk around and survived, and I think those images are worth preserving, but this was a bit of a rough ride for you, wasn't it, Matt?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I was, because I keep hearing about Nosferatu with such reverence, I was kind of looking forward to actually seeing what it was like in its entirety. I was expecting it to be a lot shorter as well, or maybe it was short,
it was about 80 minutes.
80 minutes, yeah. It felt every minute of that. Some things are very long and they don't feel their time at all, and some things just seem to stretch, and
yeah,
that is how this movie works. It's a very old film, and it seems like we've got a pattern here with a lot of old films. Like when we watched, what was the one we watched with Third Man?
We watched M.
Yeah. It reminded me a lot of that one, just in that it doesn't seem to understand a few basic principles of.
No, they don't exist yet. So.
Yeah, that's why it does seem a little bit unfair on the movie, or at least a little bit nasty, maybe to judge it by our standards. But I can't help but be who I am in the time period that I am, which means that when I watch a film like Nosferatu, I tend to get very bored, and other than a few scenes that I thought looked really, really good, it was a pretty just kind of dour experience, really.
Yeah, I think I should mention here that generally I am someone who cannot switch off when I'm watching things. No matter what sort of level of entertainment it's supposed to have on a entertainment to serious art scale, I'm generally always watching and always looking out for things, making mental notes. Essentially, writing an essay of what I think of the film as I'm watching the film is how I view film. And every now and then there is actually something which will make me switch off and fall asleep. And the first few times I saw this at university by myself, I had to keep rewinding sequences because I kept falling asleep, even though it's a fairly short film. So and I think a lot of that is to do with the editing, and in general, in particular the structural editing, moment to moment, there's some neat things. And while the theories of montage by Kuleshov and Eisenstein haven't really moved into the German film yet, there's still some neat moments where it's trying to use various images to craft a sense of vampirism and predation of the rich on the poor, which leads to some neat things like it shows a spider catching a fly in its web. It uses a Venus flytrap catching a fly. A polyp eating some other cells. And it's, hey, like, this is neat. But then you've got another 80 minutes where it's very easy to fall asleep because, in some ways, I think this film really puts to proof the reason why anyone who actually cares about film will rag on cinema sins. As a lot of cinema sins work is, if you are somehow unfamiliar with cinema sins, they are
You are lucky.
Yes, they are a YouTube channel made by people who are very good at gaming the YouTube search algorithm, so their terrible videos are very likely to appear in anything related to film discourse. And what they do is they make complaints about everything in the movie. They title their videos "Everything Wrong with X Film" in like 30 minutes or less because they keep expanding the length as the algorithm demands it. Though what they do, they claim that they are making a joke about nitpicky people, except they put actual criticisms from their serious criticisms videos inside these videos, as well as making very blatant mistakes because they're just not paying attention. Quite often they will edit footage in order to make it say something which it doesn't actually say in the film. And something that is a recurring element of this style of bad pop criticism is they often complain about films essentially not being this completely linear progression of one event leads to the next. And so, like, if someone needs to go to the shop, you need to see them get out of bed and get dressed, then close their door and then walk down the street and go to the shop. Whereas, you know, someone saying, I need to go to the shop, and then you cut to them at the shop is usually all you need. And this film, particularly through the middle, really, really drags here. Because in following the story of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Dracula needs to move from Transylvania to Bremen in this adaptation rather than London, which requires some boat travel. And so they seriously spend like 30 minutes detailing the travel by boat. And that just saps out any excitement and tension from, oh no, vampire's gonna come.
Yeah, that's basically the movie in a nutshell, just having to explain every little tiny thing. He doesn't trust, and maybe often when we say that pieces of media that don't trust their audience, so you use it as a criticism now, maybe back then it's not so much, like, it's maybe that's just how it had to be.
This film as it was had people, like, screaming in the cinema.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Nowadays, it does ruin the pacing for us, in that it does need to explain every little thing in terms of, like, both how the vampires work. Like, it'll have things like where he'll, like, see something with animals, and then he'll read something that says, oh, animals will know when bad things are happening in the world, or, oh, I have a bite on me. Oh, vampires bite people. Like, and it's at times literally that.
Yes. That one's a particularly sad one because you see the process of the man checking his neck and discovering that there's vampire bites. There's bite marks on his neck through a mirror, but you don't see the bite marks because they hadn't worked out how to get the camera close enough to the mirror and then do some makeup effects.
Yeah, that did look a little bit weird, and I was like, did I just miss that? No, yeah. I think that it's one of those things where you just have to say, look, it's clearly important to filmmaking, and those as even though they only take up a small part of the film, the shots that are good are so good, and if you can respect the fact that they, you know, help bring cinema forward, then you can just say, look, you respect this film, and I enjoy the parts of it that are of value.
Yep, that's what you got to do with early film.
Yeah.
It's just, okay, most of this is going to be wrong. Let's find the things which it does right, because then we can really learn something about movie making.
And the scenes that were good, like you talked about some of the good symbolism, I think also, like, the scenes that everyone talks about, like the creeping and the... I love the bit where this is just after the creeping upwards, and he creeps up the stairs up to the main lady in the end of the movie, and he, like, the shadow kind of pulls her. That looked really good. Like, it was at her heart as well. Like, it was perfectly placed, and it was like just pulled her up, and even that's a great visual that has survived even till now.
It's like that. There's a bit in the middle of the tedium of the boat, where you just see Dracula rise by himself, essentially levitating through some really neat editing. It's like, whoa, that's really cool. Likewise, there's a bunch of ways where they've worked out how to position operators in order to automatically close and open doors without anyone being there. There's some where they haven't worked out where to position extras and stagehands to achieve it, and so they have to just very clearly do some substitution tricks. But the ones early on are just this wonderfully smooth transitions.
At that point, especially the ones early on in the film before things had started to get quite boring and mundane, like that was because that stuff is some of the stuff that is still good even today. Like that was when I was still pretty excited about the film because it felt like more like a modern film at that point when it was just like he was going into the castle and the doors were opening up for him. Like that felt great. That was really good. I think this is a slight segue. It probably shows there's not that much to talk about Nosferatu as we're both kind of going on tangents like you went with cinema.
I'm going to pull out another one.
Okay. Well, first, I will say that it does show that, like, a lot of times, even nowadays, we often kind of boil down, like, movies and TV shows to, like, very small amounts of scenes. Like, these are the scenes that are most important. Sometimes even one scene. It's like, this movie's all about one scene. And I feel like with Nosferatu, it shows the lie of that because as good as like those small scenes were in Nosferatu, they don't save the experience as a whole, at least nowadays. And it shows that a movie is more than its most famous scenes, and the actual experience of it. Like you actually do need, it's a holistic kind of thing. Mm-hmm. I think Nosferatu does show that pretty well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Now I think now that this is the third or fourth. Yeah, this is the fourth 1920s film we've done, or very early 30s. I think you can now understand why I showed you the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari first out of all of these.
Yeah, because it's the best one.
Yeah, and like now that you've seen like just how much is being worked out, you can see how much Caligari achieves as far as being a narrative that actually pulls you along the whole time while looking really good.
Yeah, it especially, I think the visuals, especially of Dr. Caligari, are just like so far beyond what these other movies have done, and also just like the ability to, the way it tells its story is so much better. Like there's no, I couldn't notice it when I watched it. As you say, like now that I've seen these later ones, well, not later ones,
these earlier ones,
but for me later ones. And I see that kind of like, we've got this pattern now of these old films that just focus too much on the mundane things and not just like the sequence of events. And it has been a little while since we did Caligari, but I don't remember that as much.
Yeah, it's not really a problem there.
Yeah. And so like, it doesn't sound like it's not a very exciting like kind of point, but it is so important. Like just that ability to be like, to say, this is the important elements of this story. These are the important scenes to get across whatever kind of story we're telling and the themes that we're telling. We don't have to explain every little thing. And yeah, I think that definitely Dr. Caligari is looking better all the time.
Yeah.
These old films.
And like even that it's like comes up with things like having a bookend to save itself politically. And like that adds to the narrative and adds layers to it, and the whole thing's this really nightly. I've been mentioning Keira Knightley all day while we were watching, and I don't know why I confused Winona Ryder with Keira Knightley.
Do you want to watch, like, what's a good Keira Knightley film? Atonement, I believe people like. Do you want to watch Pirates of the Caribbean?
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, some of the dresses she wears remind me of Pirates of the Caribbean, is I think where I'm making this connection, as well as just really bad attempts at English accents.
So she is English.
I mean other people.
Oh, right, fair enough. Yeah, we're gonna go into someone very soon, I think.
Oh, yes, we will. Shall I move right there, or do I have anything else? I mean, like, that's really what I was wanting to get across with Nosferatu. I knew it wasn't going to be your favourite experience. But we got stuff out of it.
Yeah.
So let's move on to the main event. Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. Can you give me a 1 or 2 word summary of this film?
Wow. That's as best as I can do.
Yeah, mine is a 2-word summary, and that's why I put in that qualifier, the most. This movie has no chill.
It's just 100% at all times. It's always at, the volume meter is always as high as it can go. It's always screaming at you.
You were making some comments about comparisons to Rob Reiner's Princess Bride early on into this film. And, there's that scene in Rob Reiner's This Is Spinal Tap where they're all... So, you see, our guitars and our amps, they go up to 11. Because, when you really need that extra bit of oomph, you can just turn it up, to 11. And the producer just says, well, why don't you just make number 10 louder and turn up to that? They stare at him blankly and say, well, let's go up to 11. This is a movie which made number 10 louder.
Yeah.
But it didn't turn up to it. It just stayed at number 10.
Most of the movie, it does slow down a little bit in the last, say,
the
half
third
an hour.
act.
But before it gets to that stage, it is just all the time. It is all action, all the time. There's not a moment's rest. As I was saying before we started the podcast, I pretty much gave up writing notes. And it's not because I didn't have any notes to write. It's because I was realizing that every time I looked down,
you missed something amazing.
Something. And that's always a risk when you're doing podcasts and writing notes for any movie, but especially for this one, where I just could not look down for a second because it's almost in some ways like that Lego movie, how there's always something going on.
Yeah.
In that movie, and it's not quite like that, and that's usually almost on purpose. In this one, it's just something crazy is happening, and I think what's hard about it is that sometimes it's a sound, sometimes it's something that's going on in the background, sometimes it's a transition. It could be an acting choice. It's just you never know what it's going to throw at you at any moment.
Yeah, to compare to the Lego movie is always throwing things at you because it's operating on so many levels at one time, where there's these incredibly clever visuals, this really great sound design, this incredibly well-scripted funny script, while also this really thought-provoking script and themes that are making you think all sorts of ideas. This one is the most because its visuals are bonkers. This film opens with an ominous man giving this deep, mysterious backstory, while this brightly lit, fierce red soundstage has men completely in shadow slaughtering each other, followed by Gary Oldman as Vlad Tepes wearing the most LARP crew Blood Knight armor you've ever seen, furiously yelling, kissing a woman, and bursting back into the shadow, into that black and red tableau, returning to the killing field, slaughtering hundreds of thousands of men, discovering that his love has fallen off a cliff, which is a hilarious green screen shot, and then stabbing a stone crucifix with a sword, causing both the crucifix and every statue of a cherubim, a seraphim, the Virgin Mary to bleed tears, which he then drinks the blood of and screams as the opening title, Bram Stoker's Dracula, appears in this Cyrillic font on a stone tablet. That's the first 2 minutes of this film.
All the while, there's this bombastic OST playing. There's just brrr, brrr. It just does not stop.
And then from there, we then discover. It then goes to Tom Waits in a cell with this crazy ass high angle, which is also a Dutch angle shot of him eating a fly in an asylum. Followed by then actually explaining that our protagonist is off to do the plot of Bram Stoker's Dracula. We have the young member of a real estate agency going to facilitate the negotiation with a count in Transylvania to purchase some land in London. And then we discover who our protagonist is. Fresh off Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, 1992 this is, Keanu Reeves as an Englishman.
I wrote in my notes, Keanu, no. I just couldn't believe, because I didn't know. I didn't know what I was in for. I
even gave you foreshadowing. I said, do you know the casting of this film? And you said, oh yeah, it's got Gary Oldman, hasn't it?
Yeah.
That'll be cool.
Because even though, even despite Adam's great description of the opening scene, I still thought this was a serious movie when as it was at this point. And so when I was like when Keanu started talking and like that horrible English accent, I couldn't believe it. Like I couldn't believe that because it seemed like a very expensive film. It looked like they'd really thrown it all.
$40 million.
I'm no good with.
So that's like mid-tier budget at the time.
Mid-tier budget. They did pretty well. Like it's a beautiful looking film. Like when might rag on it, we might laugh at it, but it looks amazing.
Oh, it's the most, but it's a gorgeous the most.
Yeah. And so at that point, I was just like, I couldn't believe that casting choice. Like that, it's insane. I'm not even if it was supposed to be a comedy right from the start, it's still an insane casting choice.
It's hard not to read this film as a comedy most of the time.
And he's hilarious the whole way through. It's like with Bane in The Dark Knight Rises, but usually you get used to his voice by the end of the movie. In this movie, that's not what happens. You laugh even at any stage of this film. If Keanu starts talking, you're liable to start laughing.
Oh, yeah. And I think the key there is that Bane is a recurring presence throughout The Dark Knight Rises, whereas Keanu Reeves disappears for the entire second act of this book and this film. So you forget how bad the accent is. So then when it returns, it's not only great, because it's also at a point where he's at his most passionate, so he loses his accent halfway through the scene.
Yeah, because there was like one scene in particular. This was like right deep into the final arc of the film. I think they're on a train or something, and that's when he gets the accent properly back.
Yes.
And it's just felt so long since we heard it, and it's like the third act. It's like at its most serious at that point because we're literally traveling towards a conclusion, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how serious the situation is. It doesn't matter that Winona Ryder, Mina's character, is dying. Keanu Reeves is talking, and it's funny.
So, Keanu begins this movie traveling to Transylvania, and here is where I think we should mention that both of these films try to adapt elements of how the source text was written. If you've never read Bram Stoker's Dracula, it's a pretty cool book, much like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a pretty cool book. There's some good horror in the late Victorian era, and so how the book is written is it's framed as an historian collecting all the evidence of this incident that happened. And so it's just random letters people send to each other, newspaper clippings, interview recordings, transcriptions of medical notes, things like that to discover, hey, here's this, I'm uncovering this secret of an incident with a vampire. And that's pretty neat. So the Nosferatu just flat out does this by just having recurring moments where people are checking pieces of paper with writing on them. And with this one, we see various scenes as just people narrating the thing that they are writing to try and convey this. So our next scene is Keanu Reeves on a train to Transylvania, reading out the letter that he has written, while also looking at a letter he was sent, which then gets narrated by Gary Oldman. Meanwhile, the sky has gone back to that studio red lighting on a black lit background, and Gary Oldman's eyes glow with this violet gaze floating in the sky as they start to grow and fill the entire frame. We're 2 scenes into this movie.
That's not the first time as well that would be a recurring element, seeing his eyes in the sky. Like, I am now thinking that it is the 90s, and as much as I thought this movie was a comedy the whole way through, pretty much, like...
This is Ken Sorbo on mainstream primetime television.
Like, it does, if I can try and fling myself back to that time period, I can kind of see it, like, see how they might have thought that, yeah, this is okay. We can just have Gary Oldman's eyes in the sky as he travels along. But right now, it's so funny. Like, it's just, you can't not laugh.
The camp levels are incredible.
It's a little bit like, I mentioned, actually you mentioned him first, but I was also thinking about him like the Joel Schumacher, like just him in general. I was thinking especially Batman and Robin, but just that like level of camp and insanity. It just reminded me of that a lot.
Yeah, I was thinking of his really crappy Phantom of the Opera movie where he cast Gerard Butler as the Phantom, and if you've ever heard clips of that singing, it's not singing. And like, there's points where, hey, there's this secret lair that the Phantom has, and it's framed in the book and in the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical as being a reflection of like this hypnotism that the Phantom has cast on the lead woman. But in the musical, in the Joel Schumacher film, you see candles actually diegetically rising up from a lake. We know it's diegetic because they stay there for every other scene in this area. And there was a moment where Dracula and Winona Ryder, Mina, dancing in a black void surrounded by candles, and it's clearly an expressionistic statement, and that really highlighted that as much of an insane hack Francis Ford Coppola is when it's not Apocalypse Now, he's still better at making things make sense than Joel Schumacher.
I feel like it's a common thing, like with directors that we haven't really, not a big fans of, like the ones that just don't seem to understand the difference between like something that's literal and something that is either expressionistic or metaphorical or something like that. Like we talked about with like Zack Snyder a little bit, just like more simplistic directors seem to struggle a little bit. I would say, but because I think most of this talking about this film will be talking about the funny parts of it, because that's literally almost every scene in the film.
Yeah, I'm tempted to just like our breakdown of just the base outline of this story just gets outlines what insane visual moments coincide with that scene.
But there is just one thing, like with you were talking about how the adaptations, like of him talking, like the way that both the films try and use elements of like characters writing things down or through newspaper clipping and stuff like that. And I think it does show, like, that's probably in both films weak parts.
Yes.
And I think that it's something to make note of, is that to make a good adaptation, it's not about taking these like service things. When you look at, say, with Count Dracula, it's not about the fact that she used newspaper clippings and that kind of a framework when you want to do an adaptation. It's about the general themes about Count Dracula, about this guy who preys on people. It's about like the more core story.
Yeah.
And that's when you want to adapt something, that's when what you want to look at, not that surface level stuff.
And if you're going to copy that sort of execution, then you need to use it in a way that's appropriate for the language of the medium you're using.
Mm.
So, say, the radio play by Orson Welles maintains it quite well because it essentially transfers from journal notes to, like, combining journal notes with radio interviews. Likewise, and of course, they then took that extra step beyond when they did War of the Worlds, where, like, that's some inspired adaptation right there.
Mm.
And if you aren't familiar, that's the one where on Halloween evening, they presented War of the Worlds as being a series of news bulletins and interviews with scientists detailing the impending Martian invasion. And then because they get the reports that people are taking it seriously, they got worked into a shoot, brother. And so they then switched tacks to just doing some straight narration from the book for the second half. And then at the end of it, Orson Welles gives this apology message where he does not apologize at all. And he gave such lines as, "We're here at the Mercury Theatre, decided to perform on Halloween Eve the equivalent of wearing a sheet and jumping from behind the bushes saying, 'Boo.'"
Apparently that really scared you. I could definitely see how mad he would be. Like, he'd come up with this great idea and they'd stopped his fun.
Yeah. So the point I'm getting to here is that if you want to maintain that style for detailing this thing, then you need to do it straight up as a documentary, not titled Dracula.
Yeah.
You need to frame it as like some doco uncovering the events of 1897. Like 1897, The Truth or something. And you present it as like, say, what's that BBC show where Tony Robinson goes around digging up holes in London and just discovers all the weird buried stuff that there is in England, where it's just like, here's a set of catacombs we didn't know existed, or here's like some crypt that a rich person had, or here's this entire other mansion that got built on top of another mansion.
I'm sorry, I don't know, but I get what you mean there.
Yeah, like you do it like that.
Yeah. There's an Australian horror film called Lake Mungo. which does this really well. It presented it almost like a current affairs kind of show, or maybe like a Four Corners. I'm sure most of our viewers are Australian, so they should be able to get that.
Four Corners is an Australian Broadcast Corporation expose.
Yeah, investigative journalism
Yes.
kind of thing. Yeah,
It's like the best investigative journalism Australian television has.
yeah. And Lake Mungo is just kind of like in that kind of a format, and it's one of the better Australian horror films, I think. Yeah, so that's a good example. I think. Yeah. So yeah, think about what you're doing with adaptations. Don't just like take a surface level or just try and translate something exactly. Try and think a little bit more about it.
Yeah, it gets in the way of the real beauty of this film, which is just the colourful, vibrant Baz Luhrmann camp of it all.
It's such a fun experience.
Yeah, so then Keanu Reeves meets Gary Oldman, and then we get our next fun bit of visual moments, which is as he is talking to Dracula. First of all, this film has a number of moments that I'm going to get to, which are clearly visual nods inspired by Nosferatu. But it also plays a bit on the Bela Lugosi Universal films, where the delivery of line, like, I am Dracula is a line in the book, but that specific way of just say, I am Dracula, is absolutely the Bela Lugosi delivery of the line, and Gary Oldman's really playing around with the cadence you're expecting for that line, to make it just different enough that it becomes uncomfortable. And then, after he does this, and he offers Keanu Reeves a meal, we begin the joy of seeing Dracula's shadow operate as a separate entity to Count Dracula himself. Count Dracula will be moving and saying things which are suspicious, while at the same time this huge shadow of himself projected against the wall initially is just operating out of sync with everything he's doing to draw your attention to why isn't that shadow doing what it does, and then it just starts operating completely independently. It just starts moving around, trying to grasp at Keanu Reeves' throat. Then when it discovers Keanu Reeves has a sexy fiancée that he wants, then it starts actually trying to throttle him. And when Keanu turns around and starts noticing the shadows behaving improperly, suddenly Gary Oldman's on the other side of the frame.
Yeah. This movie loves teleporting characters and just characters appearing in places.
Oh yeah, so then the scene closes with Gary Oldman's shadow enveloping the entire frame and snuffing out a candle. This film is fucking awesome.
I think the idea is, I guess the shadow is like, it's like the inner, it's like the id.
Oh yeah, like it's so obviously just reflecting his actual mindset. And then this final enveloping is just like, you are in Dracula's power now. There's nothing you can do. He's got you. This film is not subtle. Like, all these visuals are really easy to interpret. They're like, if you were to scripting like a sitcom about film, you call it like, say, The Critic or something, and you get a bunch of Simpsons people to write and animate it, what you'd do is you'd have a sketch where you're making a joke about, like, say, hey, we got Baz Luhrmann to do a Dracula movie. Imagine how that would look. These are the sorts of visuals that you would expect from a parody. Like, if you just wrote down, what is the silliest way you could visually present any idea from this book? It just goes for it.
It's either supremely confident or they were in on the joke. And I do not know. And
it doesn't matter. Because either way, you're gonna be smiling.
It would be nice to know, though. I would love to know what Francis Ford Coppola was going for with this film. Like, whether he was just really earnest about it or whether he was making a joke.
Yeah, so I want to talk about some other actors, so I guess I should quickly go through. So Keanu Reeves winds up getting trapped in Dracula's castle, where he gets feasted on by some lady types, some lady friends that Dracula has, who keep nibbling on him but don't actually turn him into a vampire. Meanwhile, Dracula successfully moves over to England. He kills everyone on board the ship that he used to get there. And then he bites and sucks the blood of a friend of Mina, Keanu Reeves' fiancée. And I'm going to get to some stuff with her, but I just want to quickly run through the plot for anyone who doesn't know. So then Dracula has rejuvenated enough energy that he can then make himself look handsome and attractive. And he then attempts to seduce Winona Ryder, Mina. He attempts to seduce Mina.
Yes.
And, of course, this is seduce in that wicked prologue way, where by seduce we mean attempting to play with alcohol and abuse her. And this film goes, oh yeah, she's actually okay with this and is actually falling for him. And then her friend Lucy, who got bit by Dracula, has a bunch of friends who are all and a fiance who are all very concerned for her ailing health. So they call in one Dr. Van Helsing, a medical professional and eccentric.
Insane person.
He's Anthony Hopkins. They call their friend Anthony Hopkins in, who does Anthony Hopkins things, which results in him working out, hey, you've got a vampire problem, mate.
Got a bookable problem.
I checked my vampire guidebook that I found, and now I'm going to reveal this information to you while teleporting, because I'm just that awesome.
He sees his like professional like skills are tantamount to the fact that he just looks and finds the bites. Like the doctors beforehand don't know what's going on.
But there was a choker on her neck then.
Oh, of course. Like,
remember, it dramatically unclasped itself when they walked away.
Oh my god, yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, they were like, I wonder what's wrong with her, and then like the choker unclasps like for no reason, and then the camera just like zooms in on the bite,
which then transitions to the eyes of a wolf.
There's no wolf in the next scene. It's just a wolf. Amazing. I'm sorry, I just had to get that out.
No, it's fine. This movie's nothing but these sorts of moments.
Yeah.
So Van Helsing's all, yo, you got a vampire problem. We got to cut off her head and hammer her through the stake once the process is complete. And they do that. Meanwhile, when they then go, okay, we got to go beat up Dracula. Meanwhile, Keanu Reeves successfully escapes from Dracula's castle, gets saved by some nuns in a convent. So Mina goes over to Romania and gets married to Keanu Reeves there. Then they come back, they decide, hey, we should take care of this vampire thing. So they go to kill the vampire, but instead, the vampire turns into mist, and then does some more seduction. Air quotes here on seduction of Mina, who's then all, yeah, I'm down with this, can you make me a vampire too? And he does. Then all the men burst in and scare away Gary Oldman Dracula. So then he has to nick off back to Romania because they got rid of all the rejuvenating earth that he needed. And so everyone then heads to a climax there where they manage to kill Dracula, with Mina delivering the final blow, thus unsealing the curse of his rejection of God in the beginning of the film when he stabbed that cross, resulting in the stone crucifix healing itself. And everyone's happy now.
Yeah, it's funny, they both had very abrupt endings, and it felt right for Nosferatu, because I feel like old films seem to have abrupt endings, but this one as well just sort of just stopped. This is the final scene. She like cuts off his head. Very violent for Mina to do. Like she hasn't shown any other violence in the whole film. And she just like just takes the sword and like decapitates him, and it just ends. Like it just cuts very abruptly to the end credits. Yeah.
So where do I take things next? This film is written by men, and it is shot by men.
Yeah.
And it shows. Boy, does it show. This also leans into very heavily the Madonna whore complex, where you've got two women in your script, exactly two women, therefore one must be a symbol of virginal purity, and the other must be a woman of loose morals, by which we mean she likes the sex, and that's a bad thing. Not only does Lucy, who is the whore in this Madonna whore dichotomy, not only does she spend her first scene flirting with every man in the room in the most egregious manner possible.
It's hilarious. That whole scene is hilarious.
Oh, that scene is hilarious. And it's just like, it would be that much better if everyone was just, yeah, that's cool. But then, to really get this message across, her next scene where she gets bitten by the vampire while also having sex with the vampire. And she is then switched to wearing nothing but scarlet robes. Do you get it? The red-haired woman with scarlet robes, she's a scarlet woman. She's a whore. Do you get it? And it just does scene after scene like this. We've already been alluding to it, but the scene where Mina meets Dracula, he pops up and says, hey there, I'm really interested in you, and I'm going to use this asking directions to a movie theater as my double entendre. And Mina just says, no, go away. And when he pursues her, she says, no, I'm engaged. She flat out claims that she's already married just to make this guy go away. No, yeah. I'm not interested. And so his solution to this is to teleport in front of her and keep pressuring her, and then she says, oh, all right, let's go on a date. Like, the level of cajoling there is to get a reaction out of her, and it's framed as romantic, is the problem. This is written by men who may have heard that Anne Rice likes to write sexy, horny vampire books, where women get seduced by the darkness, but he doesn't understand that there's like that sense of isolation and separation from society, and here is someone who is absolutely separate from society, but they're okay with that, and they're okay with you, and they're interested in you, and that's where the attraction comes from.
It's funny because in a different context, the fact that he literally teleports, which is funny visually, but also it's just like in a different context, it's almost like with that kind of person who just keeps like following this lady after she rejects them over and over again, literally teleporting. It's like that version, but like to the extreme. Like
yeah, it's like
horrible like man who is just following someone down an alley or something like that. Like,
yeah,
literally has superpowers.
All the visual language is just straight up here. Like, this is the tactics of an abuser taken to the extreme.
Yeah.
But it starts framing it as romantic and attractive.
It's difficult to tell whether this is where the confusion comes in of like whether he's using some kind of some kind of hypnotism or something like that, and that was the only like possible saving grace of it. Like he's just using his supernatural powers. And
at the start, he's all see me, you know, like in What We Do in the Shadows.
Also, it also reminded me a lot of the Love Witch at certain points in this movie, especially when Lucy's talking to Mina, and she's like, well, maybe I just know how to please a man. It reminded me a lot of just like...
Yeah, and with there, it's like making actual statements about a certain pattern of behavior.
Yeah.
And here, it's just, you know, she's a dirty girl. And now she needs to be punished for this.
Yeah.
Whereas here, our simpler version, Purity, who is then seduced, and then on their dates, he then starts plying her with absinthe, which then leads to one of my favorite edits in the film, since earlier, in a previous scene when all the men were investigating, hey, maybe this woman's a vampire, and you then see her being manipulated, directly controlled by Dracula. And the way that they're indicating this is they keep doing shots of a bunch of red blood cells moving in the direction of Gary Oldman's arms. So then they mimic this shot here with the flow of the absinthe in a glass. So Gary Oldman is plying her with alcohol, and it's framed as romantic.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
And I guess that's one that does pay to my like mesmeric theory, because it literally is having her use him use alcohol as like a plying agent. Like, what can you say? Like, it's horrible, and at the very least, Dracula is no, not really. Like,
well, he dies, but it's framed as like this tragic redemptive moment.
Tragic redemptive, yeah. So it doesn't even do that. Like, it's not very good. Let's just say that.
It's what kills the humor.
Yeah. And it makes those scenes, like I said before, that the weakest scenes are the later ones at the end and the adaptation stuff, but that's probably not really true. The most weakest ones are the ones that make you uncomfortable, rather than make you bored or are just bad.
And it's not to make a statement, it's occurring out of ignorance.
Yeah. And I guess that was one thing. I didn't know how much of a comedy this would be going into it. But I did know that there was some unpleasantness surrounding it. I understood that Winona Ryder did not enjoy her time on set, and you can see why.
Mm-hmm.
She has to kiss a lot of older men in this film for no apparent reason. Some of the times it's just completely pointless, and she's always having to act. She's always having to like take off her clothes, and I'd imagine that
And make sexual moans as she's getting hypnotized or
Yeah.
falling asleep and turning into a vampire.
yeah.
Which is all a shame because there is again this once again with this film having the subtlety of a brick. The second she's been bitten by the vampire and drunk some of his blood, she then instantly has a change of clothes to a black dress as opposed to the white dresses she wore before, for she is now tainted.
Yeah, it's a shame because I feel like with a little bit more care and maybe a bit more knowledge even on the parts of the people making this film, or just different people, you could have turned, like, it could have been as entertaining and as funny as the rest of the film if they had just thought about things a little bit harder.
Yeah, you either use these rapey elements to then directly criticize that sort of attitude, or you take things in a wildly different direction where it's then actually like this mutual thing.
Yeah, you can either have it be a mutual thing, you can have it criticize it, you could show just how ineffective his attempts to romance her
Yep.
are. Like, she just continue, like, what she does right at the start rejects him is what she always does, and in the end he has to revert just straight up.
Just
use
straight
your
up
magic
mind
power.
control,
Like,
yeah.
Yes, you will marry me right now. Just, damn it. Like, those are kind of your options.
Yeah, and this is the sort of film where just him waving his hand and saying, you will marry me, while the sound goes, is absolutely the sort of thing that would fit in this film.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, Anthony Hopkins has a scene where he literally says, I am going to hypnotize you now, then waves a candle in front of her face.
Anthony Hopkins is a treasure in this film.
Yeah, everyone, like, this is a film which has Wesley from The Princess Bride, and he is not the hammiest man in this film.
He plays like almost a straight man in this film. Wesley from The Princess Bride is the straight man in this film. He's the grounded character.
Him and Keanu Reeves.
Can I just mention quickly that when Keanu Harker, I believe, is the character.
Jonathan Harker.
Which is a cool name, actually. Harker's a cool name for anything, for a fictional character. And when he escapes from the castle and ends up in Romania, when he comes back into the story, basically, he's got, like, white hair.
His essence has been drained by all that time with the lady vampires. It's the worst cheap hair dye that you've ever seen.
I just can't imagine it. Like, I have to, once again, as I said, with the eyes in the background, I have to remember this is the 90s, and so the fact that this reads as comedy to me might not be true, but you just cannot, like, especially with the accent as well, like the hair and then the accent, it's just, you're just laughing on the floor every time. And I feel like it changes from scene to scene. Like, I'm certain, actually, that there are times when it looks different. Like, sometimes it's just, like, some of his hair, and then sometimes it's, like, a really bright kind of white. Other times it's just kind of dull. Sometimes it's the entirety of his hair.
It wouldn't surprise me if there were, like, arguments in makeup every morning when they rocked up to set.
I like the idea of there was one person on the set who, like, probably didn't realize just how funny the whole movie was going to be. Maybe in, like, the art department or the makeup department was like, this is insane. What do you... No. No, Keanu can't go out like this. He looks like he just spray painted his hair.
I feel like we've got to mention here that, like, this shows just how young and naive Keanu is. Like, he's hot off Bill and Ted. He can't act. And it really put into focus just how good an actor he is now, and how hard he works to achieve roles. Because I was just thinking that if he were hired to be a late 19th century Englishman now, he would spend like 2 years studying linguistics and spending time in Cambridge, talking to linguists and language historians to find out exactly what dialect he needs to use and what inflection, and just rehearsing that.
Keanu Reeves has come a long way. It's funny because he's kind of... It's a bit like, imagine if Arnold Schwarzenegger, like, turned into, like, an amazing actor, like, at the end of his career. And that's kind of what Keanu Reeves has done. Like, I understand that he kind of started more on comedy, Keanu Reeves, but, like, he's always, like, for the longest time, he's been known as...
Whoa.
Yeah, whoa, man. Like, action man. Like even
Not even that, just mediocre acting, man.
yeah. And
Yeah,
Despite how-
the man who would one day do the real Lolita shit scene. It is incredible to think that he started out here. You can do anything. If Keanu Reeves can do this.
Yeah, it might be horrifically sexist, but at least Bram Stoker's Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula.
At least you
it's
can learn
uplifting.
something as a man.
No, it's still insane they casted him there. Like even it's funny. Like even if he would do this now, if you decide, you would still be insane to cast him as an posh upper class Englishman, even if he would do that now. And it's even more insane to cast him back then. I would love
like
to
you'd
know
think
what
like
the-
Colin Firth or something would be the choice.
Yeah. Or just someone who's English. Like, there's a lot of cheap English actors out there. There always has been.
They're usually on BBC shows.
You can find them anywhere. They'll do it. It's he sticks out like a sore thumb, and everyone
And
else.
that's wonderful.
Yeah.
In any other film, that would be detriment.
And as I said, that's why like in my notes, one of my few notes I actually wrote was no. Oh my god, because I didn't realize that actually no, he would be very fitting because everything else in this movie is just so insane. So why not one of its main casting choices?
Got any other comments? Because I'm just thinking about every now and then there's a weird continuity error in this film.
Yeah.
And you just don't care. It's like Anthony Hopkins is standing behind a bunch of reeds.
Yeah.
And then in the reverse shot,
They can't.
there's no reeds.
This is a sort of a segue, I guess, but like that's kind of sad, but it's just how it is kind of thing where if you're doing something that's comedic, it's amazing what you can get away with. Like,
Oh, yeah.
And it's probably not quite fair that you can get away with so much in comedy or just something that's really fantastical, but if you try and do something more serious, like at times, like it feels like every little thing is going to be. But unfortunately, it's just how it is. And this movie probably get away with almost anything by halfway through. Like, you're not going to question the logic of anything.
I think that's the power of comedy, that
Yeah.
when you're built entirely around subversion of norms rather than maintenance of norms, then there is so much that you can do then, because it really puts into focus how much you consider to be normal.
Like, and even though, like with the seduction scenes, the only other thing you could try and think of is just like, because none of it is real, like because it's just complete farce, you sort of just wonder whether like, it reminded me a little bit of like how a stage play might work, and like the seduction is essentially shown in like a few seconds because like it doesn't really want to go into the nitty gritty of how people meet each other because it doesn't want to go into the nitty gritty of anything. So like you could like
I'm trying to work out where we should take things next week. Whether we do some more vampires, do some ghosts, where we want to go.
Well, apparently I have to watch Twilight. Apparently
We might just do some Twilights. Do some other sorts of horny vampire stories.
This is a great movie to watch. This was an amazing experience. Like,
Yes.
It is a real shame about just how horrifically sexist it is. But if you can try and struggle to get past that, it's such an experience. I can't believe I've never seen this movie before, and I had no idea what was waiting.
Yeah, there's... Sometimes you'll meet people and they go, hey, that's a pretty good movie, because they might have seen it when they were a bit younger and they just remember this vampire movie, which was visually impressive. But yeah, anytime anyone who's actually seen this as an adult, it will blow you away.
Yeah, it's...
And also make you mad.
It does make you mad. Like, you can't disconnect just how horrible it is to Winona Ryder's, and also Lucy's character, just to women in general, just how nasty it is. It's a product of, and it's a shame to say a product of its time because it was not that long ago.
1992.
But yeah, it's the world we live in.
It's a product of the... You could just as easily have had that sort of thing happen in a film made this year.
Yeah.
It's just that now you might actually get some retribution for your shitty treatment of women on set.
Yeah. And I feel like
Maybe.
that's the worst part of it. Like, as annoying as it is to watch, like
It's the dilemma of exploitation films. It's like, are you able to watch a film where this sort of thing's happening and laugh, and through your laughter then actually get angry about actual injustices that are going on?
Yeah.
Or, like, and if this is enough to turn you off, then, like, I have no problem with it turning you off and you just moving on.
Yeah, I would say at least try it, especially because, like, there's so much fun to be had before the air quote seduction scenes start. So even if you do turn it off at that point, you've still had,
you've had an hour of good times.
Yeah. So yeah, I would heartily recommend this, and if you start to feel really uncomfortable, then just turn it off.
All right, I think we'll leave it there for today, because anything else is just like skirting around those main points. So
Totally.
thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
Bye.